So around a week or two ago, I saw Steve Kaufman's flashcard video pop up, and then about a week later, I saw Evildea's flashcard video responding to Steve's video pop up, and I did not watch either of them, but this topic interested me, so I thought I'd pile on. I've only ever watched about 3 to 4 Evildea videos. I watched his 750-hour Dreaming Spanish review, which I thought was good, and I've obviously watched the one about me. I myself am pretty anti-flashcard, but when I quit flashcards early on a long time ago, I really never looked back, so, I thought it was possible there was some argument about flashcards that I was missing, so I went into this video open-minded. I'm not going to go over every argument Steve made or every rebuttal Evildea made. Instead, I'm just going to give my own take based on what's already been said. What surprised me is after I watched Evildea's video on flashcards, I kind of ended up being more anti-flashcard as opposed to less. Firstly, I want to concede the idea that flashcards can help you. Nowhere in this video am I going to say that flashcards are just useless and don't do anything. Also, I want to concede that input is a bad tool for remembering numbers and dates and other trivial facts. I think that's true. That's a pretty obvious application for flashcards in my opinion. Also, of course, just like Evildea and Steve said, if you like to do flashcards, continue to do flashcards. I'm not here to tell you to stop doing flashcards if you like them. You should just do what you like. One of Steve's major points in his video is that flashcards lack context, and I 100% agree with that.
So rather than memorizing pairs or rules, you're expanding your sense of the rhythm, the intonation, the range of meaning of words. It's a much more complex, expanding connection with the language, which the sort of isolated retrieval of a flashcard item just doesn't do that. It's much, much more limited.
Evildea's response is basically flashcards do have context when used properly.
Okay, isolated from context, no rhythm, intonation, emotion, or grammatical patterns, just a bare pair. No, this is not correct.
We use sentences and not isolated words. We use multiple cards per word to cover different structures and patterns. We can drill structures across many fillers, like if you have a sentence, I'm allergic to X, you can remove the X and replace it with shrimp or turkey or eggs. And if we want other context like intonations, we can use audio flashcards. And I really think there's a category error happening here. I'm not sure how you can really arrive at flashcards give context using the shrimp allergy example. I think Evildea is conflating context and repetition. Think about what context actually is. Let's say you were watching this video to help you learn English, which some of you actually are. For every word you're hearing, you're getting context at an innumerable amount of layers at the same time. There's the context of my current sentence, obviously. There's the context of the paragraph surrounding my sentence. There's the context of the broader video itself, the video topic. There's the context of me being the speaker. And all of this matters because for instance, I'm speaking American English. You know the level of formality at which I'm speaking. You know I'm a male in his mid-20s, not a woman in her 80s. If you've watched my channel before, you have the context of every single video that you've watched up to this point. You can see my emotional state, for instance. Am I sad? Am I angry? Of course, this is an explainer video, so I'm not super emotional, but you get the idea. You have so many layers of context, I literally couldn't name them all, and that's why Steve is saying input is context rich. You know all of these things without anybody explicitly telling you them, and all of these things are affecting what words I use and how I'm phrasing my sentences. And all these layers are happening at the same time. Every word I'm saying in this video is landing inside all of them simultaneously. That's what context actually is, not just the words around some target word or some words in a sentence around the target word. It's all of this. Every encounter with a word and input is sitting inside a nested stack of context. And this applies whether you're watching videos online, listening to an audiobook, or just talking to a native speaker. It applies to any form of input. When you drill I'm allergic to X 30 times, none of that exists. There's no speaker, there's no situation, there's no topic continuity, there's no overarching frame. It's the same structure with different fillers repeated 30 times. That's not stacking layers of context. A better word for that again is repetition. There's really no overarching continuity between the two sentences, I'm allergic to shrimp and I'm allergic to eggs. If you were at a restaurant and you heard those two things in succession, there would be overarching continuity. But just having those two sentences beside each other, there's no overarching continuity. It seems like Evildea thinks Steve's argument hinges on this idea that flashcards are one word per card, but that's just not true. Steve's structural argument does not depend on flashcards being one word per card. It depends on flashcards being discrete and context isolated, which is true of any flashcard system, no matter how sophisticated. The underlying theory behind Steve's argument, as he explicitly states, is that language is understood as a network of experiences in your head, as opposed to discrete phrases and words. And I want to break into that more because in my opinion, I think this is the crux of the category error that Evildea is making. To explain that further, I have to expand Steve's metaphor, so I'm going to talk about what Steve actually means when he talks about networks in the brain. To me, the best way to visually demonstrate this is to get deeper into the math metaphor, because when we're talking about networks, at the end of the day, we're talking about graph theory. Flashcards treat words, phrases, and sentences like they're discrete nodes in a language that, once collected, allow you to speak that language and understand that language fluently. Whereas comprehensible input isn't about individual nodes. It's much more about the edges or the web of connections between the nodes. When you learn a word or sentence from a flashcard, it's completely self-contained. It's a discrete node on a graph. Even if you do full sentences to reinforce one structure or something similar, you're still only creating connections or edges between the words or nodes in that one sentence. But when you encounter a word or sentence in input, it's never self-contained. Every encounter quietly connects each word to each other word, even just tangentially related to that input, automatically. Because there's continuity. You're not just building nodes, you're growing a web of connections between nodes that you did not deliberately construct. In this model, we can still treat words like nodes, but the nodes themselves are not where the information primarily lives. The information lives in the innumerable edges connecting each node to every other node. That's basically the model for how Steve is suggesting language is stored in the brain. And he's contrasting that with the much more discrete network model that flashcards implicate. This graph of discrete nodes that flashcards implicates is a reduction of the file cabinet model. So yes, therefore, I do think flashcards rely on this file cabinet model.
You can even do the whole pattern recognition thing. I often do. Like, I don't create just one flashcard per word. Again, you don't have to just do one. You could do as many as you could have fucking 60 flashcards for one verb in all its different possible contexts if you want.
6 folders is still 6 folders. 60 folders is still 60 folders. The information still lives in discrete folders and your brain is being trained to retrieve them like they're discrete entries. What Steve and I are saying is, for effective acquisition, we don't need to add more nodes, we need to add more edges. And not just more edges, but like innumerably more edges. And that's why I call it a category error, because at the end of the day, these two graphs are still fundamentally different graphs. Even if we want to grant that co-location by sentence structure creates some continuity, or in graph terms, creates more edges, we're still only adding finite edges that we consciously construct. We're not talking about the innumerable automatic edges that are inherent to comprehensible input. And I don't want to go over all the implications of this in this video. I don't want to give all the reasons this matters, but I do want to give one of the most practical reasons it does, and that's anticipation. Your brain isn't scanning for words and structures when you're listening to a language. Instead, it's constantly predicting what comes next. And that prediction doesn't just draw on other words in the sentence you're listening to. It's drawn instead from every other contextual edge. Who's speaking? Where are they? What topic are they talking about? What have they said in the last 5 minutes? What tone are they using? All of those are firing at the same time, helping your brain anticipate what comes next. That's the network doing its job. A flashcard cannot generate that kind of prediction because it doesn't have all of those supporting contextual edges to draw from. This is something Steve never explicitly says in his video because it's technical, but it undergirds his entire understanding of how languages work. Language learning fundamentally isn't about words or structures. It's about invisible connections your brain has made between ideas in the target language to help you understand patterns. In my opinion, the best argument for flashcards is not to try to argue they give you context. Instead, the best argument is to say they efficiently borrow context from input. But I'm not the one arguing for flashcards. Something Steve didn't touch on in his video, but is a big reason that I'm anti-flashcard, is what I call dead information. Your brain is always filtering information from your environment to decide what it should keep and what it should throw out. The stuff that matters to you in real life sticks effortlessly. The stuff you drill with no real world weight behind it gets marked for deletion the second you stop drilling it. And spaced repetition is definitionally a hack on this filter. Your brain is telling you, I don't want this doesn't matter to me, I don't want to keep this. And the algorithm is force feeding it back to you on a schedule precisely calibrated to override that decision. The fact that you have to argue with your brain to convince it to keep a word is a signal in itself that word is not worth keeping, or at least not yet. You're trying to convince your brain to remember words or structures that you're not giving it a compelling reason to retain. This matters more than people realize when you zoom out to the actual time scale of language learning. You're gonna forget and re-remember words constantly. That's just how acquisition works. The rate of natural forgetting is way too high to manually fight it off with flashcards. The only sustainable sustainable solution, in my opinion, is to take in so much input that the words you need keep appearing on their own in real context where they actually matter to your brain. Because your brain will definitely remember words if you give them real context and real situations in which they matter. In my opinion, flashcards make way more sense when you're cramming for a test because you don't care if that knowledge or that information expires after you pass the test. But for language learning, when you want the information to stay alive for your entire life, you need a different mechanism. And in my opinion, the best mechanism, the only mechanism, is compelling input. Compelling input tells your brain to keep this automatically, so information stores itself instead of needing an algorithm to keep it propped up. I think people who do flashcards seriously underestimate the power of emotional connections with the language. There are words that I've heard literally just one time that I will never forget because of how emotionally impactful those words were when I heard them. When you look at spaced repetition compared to that, it just feels so sterile to me. It takes language learning, which is super experience-based, and it boils it down to what feels like test taking. Before we move to the next section, I want to make a concession here. This dead information stuff, this applies a lot more to intermediate and advanced learners, because beginners, if you're learning a word as a beginner, it's probably going to be a word that you're going to keep seeing continuously. These are like high frequency words. So if you're going to keep seeing the word anyway, this dead information stuff really doesn't apply. There's a moment in Evildea's video where he opens up his flashcard app and he shows all of like his decks and things like that. And in my opinion, this is what made me more anti-flashcard than where I started. Because what I saw on the screen was like at least tens of hours of work, maybe like 20 or 30 hours of work. I don't know, probably more. I have no idea. According to Evildea, to make flashcards actually do their job, you need audio cards, sentence cards, multiple cards per word covering different patterns, different decks for listening, producing, and reading. You have to build templates, generate audio, organize decks, all before you can actually use flashcards to learn a language in the first place. So this brings me to the last reason I'm anti-flashcard, and it's probably the most practical reason for anybody who's just getting into language learning, and that's a concept from economics called opportunity cost. Opportunity cost is the value of whatever you didn't do because you chose to do something else. If you spend an hour prepping flashcards, the opportunity cost is whatever you didn't do because you spent that hour creating flashcards. Every hour we spend prepping for a day of study is just an hour we could have spent actually learning the language. Throughout his video, Evildea repeatedly says that doing flashcards wrong is a real problem. Not drilling variable structures is bad, not having audio cards is bad, single word cards are bad, matching pairs are bad. That implies there's a legitimate skill floor. Before flashcards can even start helping you, you first have to understand the science of flashcards. And then you have to invest real time figuring out what you think you need to study. And then finally, after you have the science and figuring out what you need, then you have to actually create the flashcards. So you have to know enough about the language to know what you need to know, then you need to design a system for yourself, then you need to build that system, and finally you can actually use the flashcards. To me, that sounds like a huge time investment, especially if you're just getting into a language. It gives you tons of preliminary homework. Input doesn't really have that problem. The skill floor is basically on the ground. There's no wrong way to listen to something you understand. There's no system to build, there's no decks to maintain. The only thing you really have to figure out is finding content at your level. Even if you want to argue there's some skill floor for input, eventually you're going to have to get over that anyway. Because eventually you'll need to understand people speaking the language you want to learn. And let's say you're somebody who does want targeted practice. In my opinion, the best way to get targeted practice is just listen to the same video over and over again. Or on my website, Lengualytics, you can generate a transcript and just listen to the same sentence over and over again. And that would be way faster than constructing this whole system of flashcards for yourself. And I did that. I was never an ALG purist, but when I was looking for exercises to do in the beginning of my journey, what I really didn't want to do is construct this gigantic flashcard apparatus. Instead, I wanted to look for exercises that kind of already existed without me having to put in any work. So I did transcription exercises, and I did rewatching videos with English subtitles and Spanish subtitles. That stuff I did. Am I recommending it to you? Not necessarily, but my point is that I skipped over all of this setup that I would have needed if I got into the world of flashcards. When Evildea is showing off his flashcard decks and talking about all the complexities and nuances you have to understand, if I was to do that, I would say it more apologetically, like, hey guys, I know this is a ton of work, but it's really, really helpful. But he doesn't seem to frame it that way. To me, it comes off more like he's selling flashcards as a polyglot lifestyle choice. All of this setup is testimony to how well he understands the language he's learning. And I think that attracts people who want to appear more academic, but for someone like me, who just wants to have fun at a bar with my Argentinian girlfriend, it's not a great commercial for picking up flashcards. My reflection after watching both videos and reading through both transcripts is this. I think Steve is much more focused on the meta argument that says the brain learns a language a certain way, and therefore our methods should conform to the way our brain learns languages. I think Evildea kind of tries to square flashcards with the network of experiences model, but I got the impression he wasn't super interested in that meta discussion. He was making a way more practical case. He makes pragmatic arguments as to why flashcards can help you, but those arguments don't necessarily contradict anything Steve said by my reading. Flashcards could target weaknesses in your speaking and understanding. They could be a better active retrieval exercise than input, but still have all the problems Steve lists in his video. To give an example of how Evildea really isn't contradicting Steve in his arguments is, Evildea says in his experience flashcards can get you to fluency 3 times faster, but speed to fluency is only really one dimension of language learning. Let's grant that they can get you to some level of fluency faster. Do they do that at the cost of depth? I'm not arguing that point here, I'm just showing how Steve and Evildea's arguments aren't mutually exclusive. And now let me give you my very basic grug brain take on flashcards after watching this entire saga unfold. I have a very simple view of language learning. I'm okay with just taking an input to understand the language if I can do that. If I can understand something, I'm going to choose that 100 times over, setting up any rational system to try to improve myself. I don't use flashcards because there's really nothing for me that I'm in dire need of speeding up or improving. I wouldn't argue against flashcards so fervently in the beginner phase because in that phase, you're really just trying to get a grip on the language. But once you have a grip on the language, to me, it's hard to understand why you wouldn't just keep listening and keep speaking. Like, if you guys know me, you know that my solution to everything in life is just to do a thing better, do that thing. I know this video is kind of technical, but at the end of the day, I just have a pretty simple reason I don't do flashcards. I grant that if I had to take a CEFR exam tomorrow and I got killed if I didn't get at least C1, then flashcards would make a lot more sense. But currently, that's not my situation. Finally, I run a comprehensible input website called Lengualytics where you can find user-sourced comprehensible input at your level in whatever language you're trying to learn. I don't have Esperanto. I am sorry, Evildea. It's free. You don't have to sign up to look around. The link is always in the description, and I will see you guys in the next video.